Stop watching Fox or CNN or whatever you watch on vacation.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of TRD Talks Live. I'm Hiten Samtani, TRD's associate publisher, and we're here today to talk about the office. The office as a concept, the office as a business model, and the idea of space and how it's changed dramatically, not only in the last 3 months when activity's sort of been suspended, but also what it means going forward for the next 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. To talk about that, we've got some incredible professionals. And so we'll start with Nelson Mills, who's the CEO of Columbia Property Trust, which is a major owner and operator in Class A office markets around the country, primarily New York, San Francisco, DC. Nelson has about 7 million square feet in his portfolio, give or take, and really interested in understanding what it means as the head of a real estate investment trust to grapple with these issues. So Nelson, thank you. Thank you for being with us. Also joined by Susan Freeman, who's a partner in the real estate department at Mishcon Reya. And beyond that, Susan is one of the leading voices in what is being called prop tech and property technology. She is the host of a popular podcast in which she brings a lot of leaders in the prop tech space together. She's also sort of at the forefront of thinking about how we reconceptualize the office as an asset. So thank you both very, very much for being here. Lots to talk about, lots to dive into. And again, this is the office market we're going to be discussing. People can disagree about a few things, but I'd like to do this panel, if both of you are okay, under 3 core assumptions. Okay? So the first one, the concept of the office as a place in the urban core that people commute into 5 days a week for 8 hours a day, or I guess if you're in New York, a lot more than 8 hours a day. That's being questioned, right? That core assumption can no longer be made. The idea that the standard way to occupy an office is through a traditional long-term fixed rent lease, that's being questioned as well. And then predicting demand for space, and as a consequence, figuring out valuations, figuring out rent, is going to be harder than ever. Fair? Is that a fair assumption to start the discussion? Yeah. Okay.
Very fair.
Great. And if the head of a REIT is saying that, I think I'm on the right track. So Susan, why don't we start with you? You're an observer in the market. You're also participating through consulting a lot of clients on this. Let's start with just your core assumptions of the office market and how they've kind of been existentially challenged. Maybe a couple of assumptions that you had about the office in your career that are now no longer true.
Okay, so obviously I'm based in London, so primarily I'm looking at the London market, and I have to say until this enforced home working experiment started a few months ago, I never worked at home. I wanted to be in the office, so I wanted to be out and about, seeing clients and meeting people. And I think I could probably count on the fingers of one hand the days that I would have worked at home. And I don't think I'd actually used Zoom. So it was an incredibly steep learning curve, and I discovered actually, everything could be done remotely, and even the meetings that I have, okay, they're digital. Right. I'm meeting new people, actually, sitting in my office at home. So yes, so I now, can see that working remotely works. I think that must be the main thing.
That's the biggest one, right? We've heard from a lot of leaders across a variety of companies, not only in tech, but also finance, law, that I thought working from home was for, freelancers with some sort of jerry-rigged situation, but I am the head of a blue chip law firm, and this is how I've been operating. So Nelson, let's talk just as, someone who's been in the business for a long time, what are 2 or 3 things you thought about your business that were sacrosanct, that would not change no matter how long you'd be in the business, that have changed?
Well, that's a difficult question because I think our industry has been changing pretty dramatically for a little while now, even before COVID. WeWork and the whole flex space and co-working concept really uncovered a bit of a flaw in the system, right? There are a lot of deep-pocketed well-heeled companies who would pay a premium for flex space and flex leases. So that was already happening.
Okay.
And now with the introduction of this crisis, it's we're trying to figure it out going forward. What is short-term? What's the short-term impact, and what will the longer-term impact be? Right. So I think very much like Susan described, there will be some revelations through this process that some of us, some of our departments, some of our people, some of our companies can function from home or remote locations. Others not as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a bit to be determined. The extent is to be determined. So, for example, when we're all home, right, and we're all working from home, and we're forced to, and we have nowhere else to be and nowhere else to go, it works.
Mm-hmm.
When our competitors or our coworkers or our partners, associates start to come back, this group is back, this group's not, I think it gets more difficult. And then even within a company, are the future leaders and the future top salespeople and the future producers, are they coming up in a work from home environment? I think that's a little harder for me to accept at this point. But I will say this, I think there will be some lasting trends, changes from this. And we've still got a long way to go, as we all know.
There's a couple of arguments being made at the moment, which are quite interesting, which is they're seeing work from home not as a compromise, but actually as a potential step forward. I think the CEO of Quora had a really interesting, he said, look, typically you want to be where the power is. And the power is typically in your core office in New York or San Francisco, which is where you guys own a lot of property. Right. However, when we actually do remote first as a philosophy, your power centers can be distributed, which means that people in other offices have more opportunities. You don't need to be, around Nelson to advance, for example. So how does that affect the desirability of the properties you have?
Well, so I think that's true for certain industries, certain groups, functions within industries, for sure. But remember, Zoom has existed, and the technology has existed for years, right? The ability to work from home has existed for years. Yet an office did not evolve to that. So Twitter is a large tenant of ours. We have their New York headquarters here
at 245 West End.
Yeah. And they made an announcement. Jack Dorsey made an announcement, several weeks ago that a lot of his team may stay home indefinitely. And I can't speak for them, but we don't expect them to reduce the footprint of the office. We think what they're creating there within their office space and the culture they create and security and so many other things, we think there's a reason their workspace evolved to that, right? So we don't think that's going away. At the edges, yes. Could it impact overall demand? Probably. I think that it could separate the have and have-nots. So the best properties and the best locations may do fine, and the more commodity space may suffer more. It just gets a little more, it introduces a level of any reduced demand would increase the competition for that demand.
Well, you say that Twitter may not reduce the space, and let's assume that's true, but will it grow like a weed the way that these tech companies are growing? And Susan, maybe let's bring you in as well and talk about, there was this amazing thing happening in our core office markets in the US for a long time, where a tech company took 2 floors. 6 months later, it took 5 more. 6 months later, like the landlord had to sort of do this jujitsu, buy out the leases and reconfigure space, and just had this incredible company growing at the rate of knots. Even if a company now is growing at that pace, the office space demand may not be growing with it. So your thoughts on that, Susan, and how could landlords adapt?
I think the first thing to say, and Nelson touched on this, is that it is a bit early to start making predictions. And, a lot of people are, there's a lot of hype around the death of the office and everybody's going to work differently. It's quite possible that the change is less than, we think it's going to be at this stage. But assuming that, we do have more people working from home, and that the core space is going to look different, I think there's going to be pressure for it to look better, because it's going to be more important as the showcase, if you like, for the company. It's their brand, we found this, particularly with our office. in London, we configured it so that the whole of our ground floor is a client lounge, and it's sort of quite, you know, unusual. And you know, people weren't sure about it at the beginning. We have a big, you know, cafe in the middle, and it's part of our brand. So, you know, just that is the sort of thing you can't replicate, you know, with people working from home. The actual,
Well, you're kind of making the flagship retail argument for office space. Okay.
It's similar, but it's important because if people are working, you know, from home or working in a third space, you still need something that represents the brand and the culture and what the company is about. And, you know, it's quite interesting because in the absence of our being able to use our client lounge and invite people in and introduce people, we try to set up a virtual client lounge. So we get clients together in this virtual space, and we'll have the backdrop of the office. But I think in a way it'll be more important because businesses are still going to want to have, you know, their culture. They're going to be competing for talent. You know, what else will there be to show what the company's about?
Well, I don't think all companies can afford that. Perhaps, you know, the tenants, Nelson, in your buildings could afford that kind of thing. And let's talk about Class A office space right now. So I'm assuming that you've spent quite a bit of the last few months prepping your portfolio for the return, right? And, you know, getting your HVAC in like up to code and making sure the sanitary standards are even higher than they were before. Only a handful of tenants, or not a handful, but only a certain class of tenants can afford to pay premiums on that. What happens to the rest?
Yeah. So I think the basic standards are going to have to be met. Cleaning protocols, social distance, or they won't have tenants. They won't have employees won't want to come back. Employers won't have employees, and companies won't have tenants. So I think the basics are going to be met. But clearly, newer properties or fully renovated properties, or those properties that are meeting and going beyond those standards, are going to benefit. Right? They're going to attract more prospects to pay more rent. That's no different than pre-COVID. Right? There was already a divide between the have and have-nots. The newer space was outperforming both in terms of leasing and absorption and rate.
Right.
More commodity space. I think this accentuates that, right? But I do think there's going to be a basic standard of health and safety that needs to be met, even for B and C buildings, or they're going to be empty. It's just, you know, these are life and death issues. At least we're in the middle of it now. Maybe we get a vaccine and we move past it.
Right.
But that we're all hoping for that in the next several months. But yeah, I think there'll be a base standard that has to be met. But beyond that, you're right. I think the landlords, particularly with newer properties and newly renovated properties that can offer a higher grade of, in addition to less density, and as Susan said, more flexibility. If we may go to more of a hoteling model where people, you know, there's a combination of work from home and coming in. But when you come in, as Susan was saying, it's going to be important to have that culture, have the flexibility of space, have the functionality of the space. And so landlords who can afford to do that, or properties that can afford to do that and collect the rents, I think will. And commodity space is going to struggle, I think.
I think we'll talk about the hotel model quite a bit. I want to talk about it even in terms of owner versus operator, the way we see in the hotel market, and if that's going to come up in the office market. I did notice that some people have just joined us. So just to recap, we're talking about the future of the office market as a commodity, as an asset class. I have with me Nelson Mills of Columbia Property Trust and Susan Freeman at Property She and partner at Mishcon Reya. Nelson, I want to talk a little bit specifically about your portfolio. 7 million square feet, give or take. Let's just point out that investors are worried because your stock has fallen about 40% year over year by my rough math.
Right.
So there is definitely some trepidation there, right?
Yes.
But you have 7 million square feet, out of which your average remaining lease is about 6 years, and your portfolio is 97% leased.
Right. That's
So
right.
you're actually okay for now. You're okay for the
Yep.
next few years. You've got a little time to strategize. So
Yep.
let's talk a little bit beyond that. If you were thinking about your portfolio, when your leases are coming to term, what are you thinking about next? How are you thinking about demand? And Susan, I want to get you in on this as well, because mapping demand to me seems like the impossible problem right now. So let's talk about that.
Absolutely. So in the short term, it's almost impossible to tell. We're doing a few tours of space. There are a few tenants in the market, but for the most part, everybody's been home. There's not much going on in the short term. As you said, fortunately, we don't have a lot rolling in the next couple of years, so we've got some time. We are well leased. We've got great tenants. We've always paid close attention to tenant quality and tenant credit and strength of tenants. And so we're collecting our rents, and it's so far so good. But in terms of longer term planning, certainly the COVID crisis introduces a whole new element of safety and security, but also less density. The density trend had been moving back the other way for a while anyway. Okay. Right? It's fallen out of favor a bit. We were starting to move back to less dense environments. This will accelerate that. So that's a factor. Quality we talked about. I think if there's less demand overall and it's more discerning demand, I think having the top quality buildings and providing great services. But I think the big thing, and you touched on earlier, Tim, was just the flexibility in lease terms, right? Signing the 7 to 10 year lease. I'm not saying it's going to go away, but there's going to be a lot of pressure in the system to resist that. And that was
JLL had a report that just came out, I think yesterday, that leases are getting shorter and shorter anyway, maybe less so in the US, but definitely in Hong Kong, in the UK and stuff. So yes,
definitely. So that
how
trend,
do you value
that
your portfolio? How do you value your portfolio in the face of that, right? Because you're a public company, you're answering to investors. You're going to say, well, this 7 million square feet, you could put a net asset value of how do you do it when you don't know how long the lease terms will be? And
well, we do keep a pretty tight view on what our values are, and clearly this has impacted that value somewhat. As Susan said, it's a bit early to tell, the breadth and depth of this issue, and when we get past it, and whether it's a flat, no curve, U curve, it won't be a V curve. We all know that now. But certainly in this near term, rents will be impacted, and cap rates, the other factor, the rate at which properties trade on any given set of income. I'm not sure that's going to be impacted that much. There's so much capital looking for quality investments. We're not as concerned about cap rates, but rents, the cash flows on which that's applied, certainly will have some short-term impact. So when we look at valuing our properties, we look over 7 to 10 year period. We make assumptions about rents and when they roll and how much market rates will grow. That's nothing new. This adds an extra element of risk and uncertainty. So yeah, it's safe to say the valuations have come down. How much and how long, and for how long is really difficult to answer. But certainly not as much as the share price has come down. I can tell you that. Hospitality and retail were hit very hard, and office was third, right behind that. And again, for the reasons you said, just a lot of uncertainty about where rents are going. Work from home. When can we get tenants back? Are tenants suffering? Are their businesses suffering? Can they pay rent? All those concerns. So we're very fortunate to be in pretty good shape right now, but we're looking to the future.
Right. I think this whole thing about getting tenants back as well as zigzagging, right? Because our government in the US hasn't really figured out how to handle the pandemic. So landlords might have been like, okay, team, this is a 3-month thing. Let's put our best foot forward and welcome everyone back. And then they're going back again. I'm in California at the moment, and I know people who started working from the office and now are back home 2 weeks later. So Susan, let's get your thoughts on that, on mapping demand.
I was just going to say in the UK, the government advice is still, just work at home unless you can't. And obviously that is not really encouraging people to come back to their offices. So we've got the shops, retail shops open now, restaurants open now, but they need office workers. And we've also got the issue with public transport, which I know you have over there as well. But I just wanted to ask a question, because I wasn't quite sure what to make of Barry Sternlicht, Starwood Capital CEO. I just happened to see him talking on Bloomberg, and it sounded sort of pretty cataclysmic. He was talking about New York office rents dropping 25%. He foresees the collapse of Manhattan real estate. A third of hotels in New York City could go bankrupt. But I mean, is that just his personal view? I mean, it sounded a little bit extreme.
I have an answer, but Nelson, you should take this first.
Well,
and I have an answer.
Barry is very smart, very accomplished investor and operator, and so obviously his views are respected. That's more severe than our view, or than most that we speak to. But again, you see what's happening around our country right now with this, continuing growth in cases. And kudos to New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey and their leadership. For the time being, knock on wood, they've gotten it under control. But until we get through this, who knows how far and how deep it goes, right? So I think as far as New York values, all those things, all those factors that existed pre-COVID that made this such a dynamic place to be, where talent wants to come and companies come here to compete. If you look at all the growth in tech and media the last few years in Manhattan, there were reasons for that. We've got to deal with COVID. Mm-hmm. Hopefully it's a shorter term problem, a couple of years or less. And but all those factors are still there. So I don't share those views, but certainly it's a challenging situation.
Susan, I think I would add to that just by saying that Barry's also a very smart deal maker. I mean, beyond all the other stuff we talked about, and he might be shopping in some way or the other. So that's something to think about as well.
I don't want, but it's interesting, Nelson, what you were saying about, all the positives about Manhattan. And, it's the same with London, and in all this enthusiasm for working from home and not having to commute, people seem to be losing sight of the fact that the reason they work in, a city like London or a city like New York is because of all the buzz, the culture, the people that you meet, all the possibilities. And I think to a certain extent, people have forgotten about that. And I think, when they start getting back to the office, they will remember why they chose to work there in the first place.
This situation, at least as it relates to New York, has been compared by several to 9/11. Mm-hmm. I wasn't here in the city of 9/11, but there were a lot of similarities. It was this cataclysmic instant event, and different than the 08, 09, financial crisis. We were still coming to the office then, at least, right? So New York is incredibly resilient, as I'm sure London and these other major cities are. So I'm bullish on it longer term. I don't want to diminish, this is a serious issue we're all dealing with. It will have economic impact, and there will be things that come out of it that will be lasting. But we're bullish on the longer term. I think we've underestimated, as one of my associates said the other day, we probably underestimate the short-term impact of these last few months. It's probably going to be a little worse than we thought. It appears to be going that direction. Longer term, we're probably being a little too, a little bit too negative on that, perhaps.
So let's talk a little bit about the models. Sorry, yeah, I should be okay. Let's talk a little bit about the models, and if you're seeing any shifts in there's been some conversation about why isn't the office as an asset class starting to look a little bit more like hotels, where you have an owner who specializes in purchasing, financing an asset, and then passing it on to an operator. Obviously, we have the WeWorks of the world and other operators of office space within a building, but we're still not seeing a Marriott or an operator, specific operator that takes care of everything like the tenant experience, which is going to be more and more important going forward, given the health issues and all that. Nelson, as an owner, operator, and sometimes developer of office space, do you see that? Would you see your company or any other companies moving toward a model which is more specialized?
Well, certainly, the traditional landlords have been moving in that direction. Okay. Some pressure from what we've learned through the co-working experience, and WeWork's enterprise business and other industrious and other competitors in that space. We've learned that one, tenants will reward the extra service, the more pre-designed space, the turnkey space. More importantly, though, the flexible lease term that puts financial risk on the operator / owner, right? As we've learned, right? But they certainly tenants will pay large premiums in many cases for that. And so, what we as traditional landlords and others in our industry have done is we're moving in that direction, and we and others like us have been doing that for some time. So we'll do spec suites and prepare the space. We provide extra level of services in certain properties. We've gotten more flexible on lease terms, not for the entire property, but select floors here, select property there, because our investors also value the security of a longer lease term. So striking that balance, but that trend, that shift had been happening, is happening pre-COVID. I think COVID pushes us further and faster in that direction because particularly on the shorter lease terms, because with all the uncertainty, tenants, I think, will pay a premium for shorter term certainty and flexibility to be able to shift, expand, contract a couple of years down the road versus 10. So,
and would you be partnering with providers like HANA from CBRE, for example, on those kind of things where they share the financial burden with you a little bit, they build out the space, they share the costs with you, and then you come to some sort of profit sharing or revenue sharing model with them? Is that the idea?
Yeah. So their models are adapting too. HANA's a great operator, industrious. WeWork is you know, they're repositioning. Sandeep and team are repositioning that company, but and they're adapting their traditional model as well to go to more of a management type role versus taking on long-term leases. So they're evolving as well. So
what happened with you and WeWork in 149?
Yeah.
That's something that I guess didn't quite work out, but there are other examples that it would. Right.
Yeah. So again, that was a win-win for both of us. WeWork is looking to shed some of their non-performing or pre-performing assets and tighten their balance sheet a bit. That property was in development. It wasn't producing any rent for them. So but it's a boutique Midtown South property. That's why we bought it. We struck an economic deal to take that back, but they're still operating two other spaces for us in San Francisco and DC. Those properties do quite well. So that was a nice win-win. But yeah, I think we and other landlords are moving more that way. Flexibility of lease terms, providing more services, et cetera. But we all have investors, right? So it's not that different. We have public investors. We also have partners. Allianz, Blackstone are partners of ours. We're the operators. We're essentially managing their money alongside ours. So it's not that big of a shift to the whole operator. We're all operators and owners and partners.
Susan, we kind of rightly so are accused of having a slightly myopic view in the US because our market is so big. We tend to look at just the US, but can you fill us in on some of the trends happening in this conversation in Europe and maybe outside, whatever other markets you feel is relevant?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, as Nelson said, this had all started, pre-COVID, which is proving to be the great accelerator. But it's interesting because some of our UK REITs have set up their own flexible brands. So you've got British Land with Story, Land Securities with Myo, and in fact, Land Securities was well ahead of the game. They actually set up their first flexible working operation in 2002, I think. So I think it was just a bit too early. We weren't ready for it then. And then I think we'll probably see more sort of partnership type arrangements between some of the propcos and the flex operators, because I think that could be a sort of win-win situation, because the landlords are looking at the margins that some of the flex operators are getting. The flex operators are thinking, well, this isn't great for us. We've got a lease, we're paying rent, but we're not getting rent in, so why don't we share the risk? So I think we're going to be seeing more of that sort of arrangement. And as you've touched on, some of the agents are setting up their own brands. Some of the agents are actually going into partnership with the flex operators. So I think we will see more of a sort of hotelification, if you like. I think it will begin to happen because property is no longer a commodity. We're looking at very much as a service, and that's what tenants, customers want. So at the end of the day, you've got to give your customer what the customer wants. Right,
and I think the interesting thing, and I guess the potential, is your brand will matter. I don't think we think about once we're in yes, of course we know Columbia is a top landlord, or Tishman Speyer or what have you, but I don't think tenants so far have used that as a differentiator, that I would move into a Tishman-Speyer building over an X building. I think that's
generally true, yeah.
That's interesting. Another thing I wanted to point out the stat that Mark Dixon, I think he's the CEO of Regis's parent company, had said that in his portfolio, tenants tend to have about 2 or 3% of their space as flex. The number that he said that's going to move to about 70%. That's mind-boggling. So
Well,
how do you, as a land, what's that?
I've said Mark is usually right. So if that's, I mean, obviously it's way above, what JLL are saying. I think they're saying, 30% by 2030. But I've known Mark for about 25 years, and he's generally right. But I heard him say that as well, and we'll see what happens. But it gets back to the point we were making. It is, early days for making big predictions. We can see things are changing. How far they'll change and how quickly they'll change, it's really difficult to tell at this stage.
Yeah.
That actually brings me to that just made me think of Nelson. You're almost in the business of being boring. Forgive me, but that's part of your business, is to be boring, is to be predictable, is to be all right. Week over week, month over month, we run a business a certain way, and we see incremental gains. With something like that stat that we just talked about, from 2% to 70%. You can't be boring anymore. So can you just shed a little light about?
First of all, Tim, you described my grandfather's office business. We're much more dynamic than that these days.
No, I can tell by the design, the funky design in front of me.
But no, we're moving. We're certainly moving in that direction. We repositioned our portfolio years ago. We had suburban secondary market properties, and when you have properties like that, you count on the tenant, you count on the credit of the tenant, you count on that 10-year lease, and you hope and pray when it comes time for the renew that they don't leave the market. They don't. What are you going to do with a 500,000 foot building in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina, right? Our strategy has shifted to, you got to pay more, right? But we shifted to being CBD gateway in the most vibrant corners, submarkets within those markets. You pay more for that, you collect more rents. But the real beauty of it is the demand is for the space and the location. The value is in the property, not in the lease, right? So you're not as so.
Explain that. That's fascinating.
Well, so if I have a suburban property and we could do a great deal with IBM or Wells Fargo or whatever for this large suburban property, it's great. They've got great credit. I'm going to collect my rents. Maybe I get a 10-year lease. Year 7, 8, right? They don't want to be there anymore for whatever reason, strategic shift, whatever. I've got to find a new tenant for that building in that very slow, low demand market. That's a big risk. And so if the focus is on the quality of the real estate and the location where the demand is, and supply is restricted, supply is tight, like Midtown South Manhattan or financial district of San Francisco, we're focused, you're not quite as worried about the lease term or even the tenant credit quality for that much, or even COVID, to be honest, because you've got a property where there's going to be that demand. So for example, the shift to flex space, shorter lease terms, more flexible working, concerns me less the higher quality and the better located my properties are, because I now have a property that, in fact, that's what we work in industrious, that's where they want to be, right? They want to be in properties like this because they're relying on that demand that they can renew every 6 months or every 2 years. So we're shifting that way as an industry for sure, and the market is speaking to us, and and we're being told loud and clear that the longer lease term is out of favor for a lot of tenants, for a lot of great tenants.
And you can make that work even as a REIT, even the way that you're structured as a REIT currently. That works for your model.
Well, don't get me wrong. I mean, the longer lease term does provide some security, right? And security and dependability of cash flows is important to investors. We respond to two drivers. We've talked a lot about the tenant and meeting the tenant demand and giving the tenant what they want, but there's also the capital, right? And so capital historically could rely on investing into a REIT, getting a nice, stable, long-term return, relatively low cost of capital, decent dividend. But now we're trading 40% off, we and all of our peers. Retail, hospitality is even worse. Even before COVID, most office REITs weren't trading that well. So you have to make shifts, and you have to look for other sources of capital, other forms of ownership. Maybe the end all isn't the long-term lease anymore. Maybe it's demonstrating the higher rent, more flexible demand, that sort of thing. So, it's evolving. I know office, compared to some businesses, can be pretty straightforward and almost dull, but believe me, there's a lot of dynamics that go into the decisions we make about what properties to buy, how to finance them, who to lease them to, right? So, I think this is definitely a challenging time, but I think it could be a real provide an open door to some real acceleration of the innovation that was already underway.
And you're comfortable that your portfolio has shifted even more heavily to core markets, New York, San Francisco, DC, given that a lot of people are saying, look, I don't need to be in New York as much anymore. I'm not talking about a mass exodus. I'm talking about wealthy people with solid jobs or semi-wealthy people saying, I'd rather buy a house in X or Y in a secondary market and have a lot more space and work remotely, right? Even with that shift, you're comfortable with your portfolio being that way?
That's clearly a factor, and you just described the decision makers, but they've also got to recruit talent. They've got to recruit a team, and if Twitter is competing head to head with Google for that top MIT student, and one says you can work in the suburban location, there's a Wendy's down the road.
No, you can work anywhere. I think you can work.
Or you can work at home, or you can work at home, or you can work anywhere, including your apartment. Or you can come into this culture we've created. I mean, you've been in those spaces, right? The Apple, the Facebook, the Twitters, whatever. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible the environment, the culture they create. Now, again, we got to deal with COVID, right? We got to be safe. We got to be safe. People got to be safe and secure. But there are a lot of important drivers that led offices and office users in that direction. Those still exist.
And I wanted to bring you both on, and I think I wanted to focus beyond COVID, because there's no point in planning everything when the fire is still going on, right? Like we're just thinking about the long-term shifts that this has brought about. And you're right, those offices are inspiring, especially for young people. They're a hotbed of social activity. They're a life experience. After grad school or college, that's the next sort of social zone. You're absolutely right about that. But I wonder if the spell has been broken somewhat by being now 5 months into this or 4 months into this. I wonder if that's broken the spell a little bit. I want to talk a little, we don't have too much time. I want to talk a little bit about the health of buildings and how buildings have to get even more, as we sort of briefly touched upon it, but I know, Susan, you had Rafer Wallace on recently, and you were talking about a lot of sort of the livability aspects of buildings becoming more and more important, not only to occupiers, but to investors and all that. So can you give us just where that conversation is at the moment? Like, where are landlords on this issue? Where are occupiers / tenants on this issue?
I think it's interesting. I mean, I interviewed Rafer because I'd seen some of his presentations, and he is a bit of a guiding light on healthy buildings and air quality. And it seemed to me that all the directions we were getting about social distancing and one-way systems in offices, was part of the story. The rest of it is what's actually circulating in the air. So it was interesting because he it's something he's worked on, for 19 years, and he was very much of the view that the property industry had been asleep at the wheel on this, and I think was really surprised at the beginning of COVID when people were saying, we don't know if the virus is airborne. He was saying, there was so much data and information showing that it was airborne. So we spend 90% of our time indoors. Actually, the air that you're breathing in the office and obviously in your home is important. Now, originally the concern was about carbon dioxide in the air, productivity. Why were people falling asleep? So people were very concerned about air quality, but now with COVID we've got another level of concern. And he was saying how important it is that buildings are monitored, and that they're monitored on a regular basis. You can't just do a health check, once a year. You
Right.
need to be aware of what the air quality is.
But is there any universal standard that's being put on? Is there any talk about let's get a standard the way we have LEED or the way we have something else? Is there a standard being developed at all?
Well, he's the expert on that. You would have to
Uh-huh.
speak to him.
Uh-huh.
But certainly what's going on, with the Well Building Institute, and yes, leading developers are very aware of it, and tenants, I think, and Nelson will have a view on this. I think, probably for the first time, tenants who are taking space will be asking about air quality and how the air is circulated, and they'll want that sort of data. But again, one of the problems that Reya was talking about is the need for landlords and tenants to collaborate on this.
Right.
Because if you own a building and you let it, you're not going to be able to monitor the tenants' parts of the building. Equally, the tenant won't have access to the landlord's part. So it's very important that people start sharing data, and data on buildings is going to become increasingly important, I think, in terms of funding and insurance.
Things like foot traffic within the building, which parts of the office are most densely occupied at what times, and things like that. And the promising thing is, for a lot of this, you don't need to invent new systems of data collection. We already have access to a lot of that data. It's just a matter of sharing it and analyzing it in the right way. And Nelson, as someone who's previously worked in what could generously be described as a Class D office building, right? At best, I totally see Susan's point. But in your portfolio, what sort of changes are you planning for beyond this short-term thing? What types of conversations are you having or getting pressure to have?
Well, this ties in very nicely to efforts we in the industry were already making, some willingly, some based on market demand, some based on legal pressure, right? On the environmental front, and energy uses and efficiency. So it's a different issue, but they're tied together in the sense that the monitoring and measuring of what's really going on in your building. So air quality is top of the list. I mean, short term, of course, we're looking at social distancing and PPE and cleaning protocols. But longer term, as Susan said, air quality, we're all much more attuned to the fact how important that is. And so upgrading air filtration systems, monitoring humidity, that's a big part of it. Probably running HVAC in a lot of our buildings, a lot of our spaces continuously versus the on and off and so forth. And that'll cost more, but we think that has some benefit. And as Susan said, we control we control the building and the common areas and the overall systems, but cooperating with tenants, communicating with them, sharing data with them. It's really a partnership between landlord and tenants. So a lot of those things are underway. We're going to be better for it, right? I mean, it's one of the benefits of having to go through this is COVID's not the only reason, as Susan said, to focus on those things.
Okay, I have a question in from the audience for you, Nelson. I don't know how you'll answer this, but I'll give you a shot at it. This is from Mauricio. He says, what about valuations of your assets? What percentage decrease do you envision if the market doesn't recover to pre-COVID occupancy?
Yeah.
How do you go about that?
Well, you heard Barry's view earlier, Susan quoted, and I'd say, there's a lot being tossed around about, maybe in the near term. So near term becomes long term if the questioner's premise is accepted. This 10 to 20% down possibly, but I think that's not really the way to look at it. There's such a disparity between types of properties and locations and so forth. Again, the commodity space that can't meet all of these demands, or the landlord who can't be more flexible on lease terms and provide more services or keep the building safer, older properties versus new. There's going to be a wide disparity, on valuations, depending on those factors. So I think it's certainly down, right? It's certainly down in the short term, and if you accept the premise that not as many people come back to the office, it'll be down longer term. So that's a given. The degree has everything to do with basic supply-demand fundamentals. higher quality, better located is going to do better. So I think for a landlord and an owner, that divide we already had between high quality and commodity it's only gotten wider. And I think we're going to have to be better operators and more discerning investors to navigate this.
I think we've touched upon many big ideas, and that's what I was hoping for in this panel. I'd like to end with just a question to both of you in terms of your partnership with the cities that you're in, or in Susan, in your case, the partnership that your clients have with the cities they're in. Now, even more than before, you'd want your cities to work with you, or local governments to work with you on things like rezoning, repurposing space. All of that is going to be very important. What's going to happen to all that retail around your office space, for example? That a lot of that is going to die and hopefully, be reborn as something else, right? So what are the things you'd want to see from local governments? Maybe talk about London and New York, that you'd want to see in terms of helping the office market be a sustainable, long-term, excellent asset. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I was thinking more like bigger picture, because
Go ahead.
We were talking about this earlier. So in terms of London, at the moment, we'd all hoped that this pandemic was going to be a sort of once in a generation opportunity to change the city, because, like many cities, we become so reliant on the car, and, the cars haven't been there. We've got whole, streets in the West End of London at the moment that have been closed to cars. There are tables and chairs, restaurants have put their tables and chairs. People are eating outside. There's less pollution. People are cycling and people are walking. And you can see that is the way to bring back,
Right.
communities and actually get people shopping, and eating out in their areas. But the problem is that, at the moment, with the concern about using public transport, as soon as people start coming back to work, they're going to want to drive. And, Amazon Prime means that, the roads are clogged with vans delivering, online purchases. And I'm not quite sure how we deal with that, because, one can see how nice it is, in London, in Paris, same thing. How do you deal with the way people get around cities?
Yeah, I agree, Susan. It was a challenge before. So obviously our community, our city leaders, state leaders have their hands full, and I think they've done a remarkable job overall. At least at the local level in a lot of our markets, but they have their hands full, but not only with COVID and transportation. That's the big one for us, the mass transportation, and getting those back online and creating consumer confidence in those. But, we have this, social unrest, which is a wonderful thing that's happening. This awakening and awareness is happening across our country is a wonderful thing, but it has these birthing pains, and there's pressure on our cities and our law enforcement and our citizens, and we're very disrupted right now. So I think what you really want ultimately as a tenant and a landlord is a very livable and attractive environment as possible. Stating the obvious, but that's transportation, that's safety, security, that's clean streets, that's all those sorts of things. And you want a society that's everybody in society is winning, and so these are challenging times, from COVID to social unrest, but we're going to be better because of it. And I think we as owners and investors have a part to play, right? So we certainly are looking at it that way from our team standpoint.
I'm glad the conversations are happening. So at least this is where some of the ideas are born, and then they go out into the world, and We'll see what happens. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This has been another edition of TRD Talks Live. If you haven't already, I urge you to subscribe to The Real Deal. Our subscribers get a lot of access to features and data dives and different kinds of insights that are not available to general readers. It's also a good way to keep up with what's going on and hear from leading minds like we had today. So we have Nelson Mills. And Nelson, you're not on Twitter, are you? Where can people find you?
Our company's on Twitter. Yeah, Columbia. I don't know what to call their address.
We'll
CXP,
tweet
I think,
that
yeah.
out. And Susan Freeman's at Property She. I'm Hiten Samtani. This has been another edition of TRD Talks Live, and thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you both.